In this video, we're going to take a look at integration and end-to-end tests in NestJS. Now, if you've watched the previous video on unit testing, we have tested the feed controller and also the feed service here. And the approach that we took to do these unit tests is we tested each of them in isolation and we mocked the data layer there. And we also, for the controller, for example, we mocked the service and mocked the data that the service methods provide. And analogously, we did the same thing in the service in relation to its controller and dependencies, although this was separated from the controller. So basically what we want to do in this video is we want to look at integration tests and end-to-end test and their relationship in NestJS. And basically if I run an npm run test e2e, what this is going to do is it's going to run all of the .e2e -spec files, and these are located in the API folder in this test folder here. So by default you get this app e2e -spec file here, and this tests the the generated route, the hello world route, and it uses Supertest and it creates a instance of the application, and it is able to detect the endpoint of that application, and then we are able to make the request. So this approach, this is similar to the approach that we did in our unit test, where we were able to mock all the data and stuff. However, this is actually, well, there's two real approaches you can take to end-to-end test. And the first is mocking the entire module. So we're mocking the entire testing module here, and then we're calling our controllers and services. And before we tested them in isolation, but now we're testing the service controller and also the data layer all in an integrated fashion. So with that said, we've already seen how we can test it in this particular way. So the alternative approach is to actually test the endpoints with a database. So often it's easier to mock the database, as we mock the data layer in our unit test here. But for these end-to-end tests, I'm going to take the approach of actually making the request to our API and also having the database, things will be posted to a database. Now ideally you would want to have your own server for this, so you'd want your own separate database folder or test endpoints or something like that, a separate database instance, and also you might even want another API server. Let's say you hosted this and you had it deployed, you might want to have Jenkins server on hosted, but just in the interest of saving time, I'm just going to make the request to the endpoint of this application. So what that means is in the Postgres database here, I've just set up this script, so when you post something, it's going to delete it for us, and then we can go ahead and select it again. Now you could have an endpoint in your application that does that for you, but again, in the interest of time, we're more interested in how the end-to-end tests work and the integration tests work. So I will just say, to distinguish between the end-to-end tests and the integration tests, is the end-to-end test tests the entire application. So what that means is it tests all of the endpoints in your application from start to finish. So in our case, the first endpoint might be to register a user, then you log in as a user, then you load all of the posts. You can post your own post, edit it, delete it, all those CRUD operations, upload an image, add add a friend and reply to a request. Now, obviously, there's no real point in me going through all of the endpoints like in this example, because once you've seen how to do one or two, it's more or less more of the same. And the other thing to mention up front is often if you have your entire application in this end-to-end test, it can become very large and messy and tricky to understand where all the things are instantiated and all that sort of stuff. So often people would separate this into their own individual components. So for example, what we'll do today is we'll work on this auth end-to-end test. So we're going to register a user, expect a response. We're going to not allow a user to be registered if it already exists. We're going to log in, and if they don't have the right credentials, we won't return the JWT. Otherwise, we will return the JWT. And this is a integration test for the auth controller. So it's often better to have, or it's easier to deal with having multiple integration tests rather than having it all lumped into this app end-to-end test. So we'll be focusing more on the integration test, although it's the exact same approach that you would take for the end-to-end test. It's just you're testing more things from separate modules. And like I said before, we're going to just go ahead and test it for this particular server that we've created, and it's going to be the same data layer as we would have in our real application. You would want to either have a separate database and server, and also you might consider taking the other approach where we took in the unit testing, where you actually go ahead and mock the data layer, and then you're testing the integration between the service and controller. That's personal preference. It's sort of more realistic to test it on the real database, or at least another version of the database. But in saying that, if you're laying things out in this way, as in the app end-to-end things, doing so will be very tricky, because you're going to have to create database instances, and you're going to have all your guards, and everything's going to be in here. And I did read through all the documentation, but it's not, and Nest do a wonderful job of having really clear documentation, but specifically for the end-to-end test, I found it to be quite limited in relation to using this NestJS approach. So if you're able to figure that out for this application, please send me a link to the GitHub repo or something like that. I'll be happy to make a video on that and give you a call out or something like that, a shout out if you want one. And yeah, that'd be great. But this is the approach we've taken. This is probably like the standard way you would want to do something, an end-to-end test or integration test, independent of the NestJS framework. And it works perfectly fine. So yeah, if you want to follow along for that, let's go ahead and get started. So this is our project up to date. I'm just going to cd into the API folder, and then I'm going to run an npm run start:dev, and that'll run our server for us. And I'm going to open up another tab, and this is where I'm going to run our end-to-end test. And I'm just going to execute this, because part of our test we did before, it actually uses the same database here and it doesn't remove it. So I'm just going to manually do it with this command. It's quite easy, really. Of course, you can create a more efficient process for yourself if you're doing this for real. But again, this is just to demonstrate how an end-to-end works in general. And I'm using the word end-to-end and integration interchangeably. although strictly end-to-end is the end-to-end of the entire application, as you may expect, whereas the integration test is, you know, the module in a cohesive manner where the controller, service, and data layer are all interacting with one another, or a mock of that data layer. But you know, in either case, we're still having in the the test folder, the prefix, the suffix .e2e-spec.ts. And lots of people don't even really do the full end-to-end test, even in you know, proper enterprise applications and stuff like that, just because if you have your integration test and unit tests all there, oftentimes when it comes to doing the end-to-end tests, people will actually go ahead and do it manually. But if that's, you might send it to the QA team, or you know, the developers might actually do the manual testing of things start to finish, and you should do that anyway, even if you got all these tests. But you know, if you're working on perhaps a very large project with a large team and people aren't sure of what other people are working on in the same project sort of thing, then I can see the value of these end-to-end tests, and then you might want to actually just go ahead and do that. But it would be more or less duplicating the integrated tests with a lot more headache setting up all of the dependencies and interactions and stuff like that. So with that said, I'm just going to go ahead and create a file here. I'm going to call it auth because we're going to test the auth controller. And the auth controller, it obviously encapsulates the services it calls and the data layer from the repository method. So we can just give it this suffix of e2e-spec.typescript, and we've pretty much got a blank canvas here. So let's just say we want to have our test suite. So we'll have our describe method, and what we're describing is the auth controller, and we'll put this e2e because it's the end-to-end test for that. And then we're going to have our callback here, and this is where we're going to set up our initial variables and then have further suites and it functions in here. So basically, as said before, the approach I'm going to take is just to have a URL. Now you could have this in the actual like in a constants folder, for example, or in the N file or something like that. But you know, this is testing. If things are going to be breaking during testing, chances are you want to be coming back here to change some of the things anyway. And we should be focusing on features. Of course, there's the test-driven development approach as well, where you focus on the testing first. You try and get them to fail, and then you write some code, and then you get them to pass, sort of thing. But we've sort of, and that's a perfectly good approach, and you do end up writing pretty clean code and catching things. But with this end-to-end test and this integration test for the auth controller, I've actually caught a few things that I didn't mention before. So in the previous videos where we set up error handling, we didn't set it up for all of the routes. So we actually catch some of those, but we also catch another error, and that shows why these integration tests can actually be quite useful, because we didn't catch them in isolation in the unit test when we were mocking other parts. We did catch other errors in that case, but yeah, just sort of highlighting that it's not a complete waste of time. You do catch things and you tend to write code a little cleaner. I will admit this is probably something you'd want to set up at the beginning of the project and work through, so you don't have a massive task of doing this massive end-to-end test, and you know, you forgot things you've worked on before that and all that. But nevertheless, let's just continue with this particular approach. So basically, I'm going to have a nested describe suite here, and this is where we're going to type in the endpoint that we're testing for. Now the base URL is just this, and this could easily be refactored higher, of course, but we're more interested in the actual integration end-to-end tests rather than the refactoring of things at this stage. And this shouldn't be first name, this should be, we're describing the endpoint. So you just want to write the endpoint here in relation to your base stub, and you want to put the method here as well. Actually, you can put whatever you want here, but I'm going to be testing multiple things within this particular endpoint. So that's why I'm going to have this nested testing suite here. And basically, we know that the first thing we want to do is we want to test, if we're actually registering a user when we hit that point. So we can have it should register a user and return the new user object. And that's obviously going to have its own checks to make sure it's checking the right user object. You don't want to be overly descriptive, but you want to just capture everything that the test is doing. Because when you run all your tests, you want to be able to read them easier. But that's all preference as well, so there's no shoulds in that particular case. So basically, what we want to do here is Supertest, it comes with this request method here, and this is what actually allows us to make our request, and by default it's coming from Express here, but what we want to actually get it from is we want to import all as request from Supertest, and you don't need to install this comes baked into NestJS. And now we just need to pass in our auth URL, and this is the base URL, not the final endpoint. We will amend that. So what we can say is for this particular base URL, the auth URL, what we can do here is we can say, well, we want to have a post method. So we want to post to the register method. So auth/register. Now, additionally, you can set some headers. So you might have some types of headers you need for your endpoint. In this case, I'm just going to say accept application/JSON because we're expecting JSON formatting for both the body and the response, but in particular for the request here. And then we can actually send our request. So to make the API call, and we're doing it to our server, and I've already mentioned how you'd want to do things, but we want to send something with a mock user. So we haven't defined that just yet, but if we do, we can say we can have a constant variable for the mock user, and this is actually going to be of the type user. We'll bring that in and make sure that all of your endpoints are coming from relative paths, because Jess has a hard time in the the absolute paths. So basically we want to change all our imports to be relative. So we know in the form that we send, we're going to have a first name, and we'll just call first name. We'll also have a last name. We will have an email, which we'll just call email@hotmail.com, and then we'll have our password that we're sending, and we'll have that set to password. So we've got our mock user object, we've made our request. Now we just need to expect. We can assert what we're expecting here. So we can tack on an expect, and basically through Supertest, through this request method that we're calling, this is sort of like, if you're familiar with promises, like a .then or like an asynchronous task for us. And in response, we're going to get our response, and this is of the type request.response. And we can take a look at that if we'd like. It basically, well, it extends this super agent.response. If I go into that, we can see that it has all sorts of things. Like it's going to have a body and all these other things associated with it, headers and stuff like that. So we're interested in the body of that response because we want to return the new user object that we're getting in response from our method, and we're expecting it to work in the first instance. So what we can do here is we can do some object destructuring, and for the response body we can get the parameters that we want, or the properties. So we can go ahead and get our ID because we're expecting an ID to be generated. Now we're going to get the last name, first name. Now we're not actually going to get the password, but I want to check that we're not getting the password because it's important that when we send the request and we get our response that we're not getting the password. So that's something that we want to check for. So basically we want to check that's undefined. An email, and same with the image path. We want that to be null by default because they just created their account, and we want the role to be the user because they just created the account. We don't want them to be an admin by default or anything like that. So we can go ahead and check for that, and that means if we make any changes to our auth module at all and we run these tests, we'll expect these conditions to still hold. So if I go and I get the let's see, so I've got all my properties in response now. So what I want to do is have my assertion, and you can have this nested assertion. This first one is related to getting the response, and then you can expect a whole bunch of things in here, and if any of those fail, this whole it statement will fail. So what we're expecting, well, we're expecting the type of the ID to be a number. So we didn't give them an ID, we're generating that from the API on the database. It's going to be auto incremented, and we just want any number, doesn't matter what it is. We would expect the first name to equal the mock user that we created first name. So basically we would expect no change, but this is just verifying by comparing our mock user with the response user, and that's going to be the same thing for last name and also for email. Now what we want to do is we want to expect that the password, and we expect that to be undefined. If you were to somehow make some changes and take that off in the DTO layer or the service that explicitly deletes the password, and you make a change there, you might actually get the password back, and that's a big blunder. You wouldn't want that to occur, so our testing we're able to catch for critical things like that. We can also go ahead and we can expect the image path. Now, and the user does have an image path associated with it, and when we return the user object, we expect that to be null. And we can expect that the role to equal the user. And you can also have a expectation for the status. So you can go ahead and you can expect And rather than hard code the status as 201, you can actually go ahead and have this HTTP status. You import that, and it has a enum of all the different status code. So it's not a 200, it's actually a 201, because we're creating a resource, and by default Nest will make a 201 for our post request. Now we will see just now actually that you might want to override that to be a 200, because you might be posting something but you're not actually creating a resource or something like that. So, but before I do that, let's just go ahead and run the test to see if it works. So I'm going to run npm run test, and I'm running the end-to-end test here. So we see we've got two tests pass, and that's exactly what we want. Now I will note, if we were to run this again, this would actually fail, and that's because we have this user created already. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to do this in one go. I'm going to delete and then select, so you won't actually see it, but I did just delete where the user has the first name, which is what we set. So basically what we want to do is we just want to copy this it method, and we want to check if the user is already existing. So let's see, just below this it here, I want to have another it here, and this should be, it should not register a new user if an email already exists, if the past email already exists. So basically we can use our Supertest request method and return that with our auth URL. Now we're going to be hitting the same endpoint, so I can actually go ahead and just copy this part here, and all of this is the same, except rather than doing the expectations for the actual object, we can just do the status code we expect. And what we do expect here is a bad request. So let's go ahead and save that. And now let's rerun our test. And it actually has failed for us. And we've got a 500 internal server error rather than a 400. So this has actually caught an error in our application for us that we might not have otherwise detected. So what we can do is we can actually go into our auth module, into the register endpoint here. So let's just open the controller firstly. And if we're looking at our register endpoint, it calls this register account method here. So when you register an account, it just immediately hashes the password for you, and then it tries to save something. Now, if you've already got an email in the database, obviously, worst case scenario, you wouldn't want to override that. So we will definitely want to be able to handle that. But also we want to handle it more gracefully, in the sense that rather than returning a 500, we're saying it's a bad request. So let's go ahead and handle that. And I didn't handle all of the error handling I showed you the approach to take in the error handling video, so go ahead and watch that if you're not sure how to do that in detail, although we'll do it here for this particular example. So let's just go ahead and tack on another method here, and we'll say, does the user exist? So we're going to take the email, which is just a string, and we'll turn an observable of the type boolean. And what we'll do is we'll turn, and we're going to convert a promise into an observable, so we're going to use the from operator, and then we're going to access our user repository, and that has access to the database, so we're able to use this ORM type ORM, and we can go ahead and we can find one, and we can find it based on the emailing equal to the email, or just email for short. Now this is going to be an observable, and we are able to pipe into the observable, and then we're able to call the switch map operator here, and this allows us to return another observable. So potentially we're going to get the user back, but if we don't get the user back, we want to just go ahead and return false. So what we can do is we can return an observable of bang bang user, and the first bang, it checks if it's, if it's there or not, and then it's going to be the opposite, and basically taking the second bang will convert the existence of the negative case such that if the user exists, it will return true, otherwise it will return false. So in our register account, what we want to do is we want to return this does user exist, and then we can go ahead and we can type the email in here, and then we can just go ahead and we can pipe this, and what we'll do here is we'll just tap into it, and if they do exist, because we're going to get a boolean back, we want to throw our own error, and we've already done our error handling. So if you're not sure how to do that, please check that video. But basically what we're going to do is we're just going to say, and we're going to have to import tap, I believe, from RxJS operators. So basically, if the user does exist, what I want to do here is I just want to throw a new HTTP exception and say a user has already been created with this email address. Now you might not want to give that level of detail back to the user. You could have your own custom message there, but basically we would just want to give back a bad request. So the fields are valid, the email and password's okay, but there's already a existing record there. So basically this is where we want to switch map and return our other observable. So this is returning true or false. If the user exists, we want to throw an error, otherwise we just sort of want to pass through and return our other observable that we're expecting, the observable of user, and we can more or less just copy this part we've done here down. So where this pipe ends here, we can go ahead and cut this out, and as a second here, we can go ahead and have this in here like that. we also need the, sorry, just before I do that, I'm going to have a switch map here. Because if it gets to this stage, the user doesn't exist. Otherwise, it will throw the error for us. So that means we can actually go ahead and it's worth hashing the password and storing the user and returning the object for them without the user password. So we can actually go ahead and copy this entire thing then and paste that into here. And just as a reminder, we save the method, and when we save something, we type on, we get back the object, but it has a password associated with it, so we just go ahead and delete that explicitly. I believe I also did it at the DTO layer as well. But nevertheless, let's go ahead and see if that now works for us. So yeah, this is pretty good because testing in isolation, it didn't actually catch this error when we were mocking things, but when we're actually dealing with the real data, and this integrated test, we can see things actually working for us here. And we got all of our tests passing, so that's good. Now what I want to do is focus on the login method. So basically what this should do is in the first case, it should not log in nor return a JWT for unregistered user, for an unregistered user. And then we'll have our code block doing the work for us. Once again, we use Supertest to do the request for our auth URL here. Now I'm going to just set this here. But before I do that, I'm also going to have the method here. So it's going to reach the slug and then slash login for that final endpoint there. Now we want to send something in our body for an email that doesn't exist. So what we can do here is we can just send, and to log in you only need an email and a password. So we'll just say does not at exists.com, and as a second argument we'll pass in, well, second property in the object, we'll pass in the password as password, and then we'll go ahead and we'll expect the response. This is going to be the same as it is here. And what we're expecting this to be is, well, the only thing that we're getting back from this method, if we look at the auth controller here, is this object with a token and the JWT. So we want to try to get a token but have it fail. So if we get the token, which is going to be of the type token string, and it is a string, not a JWT right now, because it's getting passed back to us in the response as a string. But we will go ahead and verify the token in the case that it is registered. But this token of a string, this is just coming from the response body. So we use object destructuring for that. And what we expect here is we expect the token to be undefined. And we also want to expect that the HTTP status is going to be forbidden. And similar to how we didn't have error handling for this setup here, this probably won't be set up just yet. So what we'll do is we'll just go ahead and just work on that. So if we go to our auth service, if we go down to this validate user, we're trying to find a user, and if there's no user, we basically have this not found for the invalid credentials. That actually is true, but it's probably more accurate if this was to be forbidden than not found. Not found implies the resource, you don't have access to the resource, or didn't create the resource. Oh, sorry. The resource wasn't found, but in this case the username and password is wrong, so we're going to forbid the generation of the JSON Web Token. So that was just a small amendment there. So if we go back to our test, it should theoretically now be working. So let's go ahead and let's just clear things here, and we'll run our end-to-end test. Okay, so we got a failing test here. So let's go ahead and look at the error. It says expected 403 forbidden, got a 404 not found. So I just need to check I changed the right thing. So let's just control F for a not found. I can't see it. Okay, so I spotted the error. The fact that the post method is not /login here. It was just login, so that endpoint wasn't defined, so I couldn't find it. So let's go ahead and try run this again. Alright, so now our tests are passing nicely. So let's just go here and clear things. And the final test we'll do is we want to verify the JSON Web Token is, is created and valid if they log in with the right credentials. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this down. So it should log in and return a JWT for a registered user. Endpoint's the same, the headers are the same. Now I'm going to go ahead and put in the mock user here, and our mock user was just defined earlier. Now it doesn't matter if it has the first name and last name as well. I've set it up so it's only going to be taking and extracting the email and password. It's coming from the client anyway. And there's verification on the client application as well on top of that. So we have the mock user here. Now this time we will expect the token to be generated. But in its current form, it's just going to be a string. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to import JWT, the JSON Web Token. So I'm just going to here import OR as JWT from JSON Web Token, and this actually, it has a method on it for us to verify the JSON Web Token. So we can actually come here and we can say, well, we expect our JSON Web Token that we created. Now you can refactor this constant out, and I have it in my environment variables, but I don't want to bring that in. So I'm just going to say JSON Web Token is our JSON Web Token secret. So recall we have this .env file here. and I'm just going to hard code that JSON Web Token. So you could refactor that, of course. It'd be quite simple to do so, I suppose. But I basically want this to be true. So we can say to be truthy. And then we expect this HTTP status here to be okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and run this test, and then we can just recap everything we've done, assuming everything passes nicely. Okay, so it didn't. Oh, okay, yeah, this is what I was talking about. A post method by default, it creates a 201 created, but this particular post method, we're posting to the server our login credentials, and we're expecting something back, and we didn't actually create anything on the server. We didn't have a session set up. We were doing the JWT way. So since we're not creating anything on the server, it's probably better if we go to our auth controller here, and I believe there's a method, just trying to remember what it is here. Yeah, there's this annotation here where we can explicitly say what the HTTP code we're expecting back to be, and this is going to be the HTTP status for OK, and we will just need to import that from NestJS common. Just checking any imports are of the relative path. And now if I just go ahead and run the test, hopefully this time things should work for us. Okay, great. All of our tests have passed. We've actually made our code a little cleaner. We've added this proper status code here. We've put this proper status code here, and we've also done some error handling that wasn't already set up. And we also added some code to check whether or not the user existed or not. So we can see that doing this integration test is quite valuable. And just to sort of recap, we went through our auth module, checked the endpoints in our auth controller, both in the case that you register or you can't register, and log in and can't log in, and the expected responses there. And we've discussed, we've focused on integration testing in particular, but you could see if you're in the app module or something like that, how you could, if you just, had more endpoints to test for, you do it, one at a time sort of thing, and expect results. You could have it there, and you certainly could do that. It's quite a time-consuming task, and you'd probably only do it if you were in the large team where you don't know what other people are working on within the same project, just to make sure everything's not breaking. But even then, these integration tests seem to be a lot more popular. So if you have the unit test set up and the integration test set up, you're doing quite well there. And you can see how we've actually caught things, and it's actually been useful. It hasn't been like a complete waste of our time. And you can imagine if you're taking like a test-driven development approach, it might initially take more time, but if you're working on a project for a longer period of time, it helps you to write cleaner code in the first instance and catch things you wouldn't normally catch. And it's probably good in the long run for things in large, multifaceted projects, large team numbers and stuff like that. But yeah, you really just got to weigh out the pros and cons. So yeah, that's been my video on error handling with a focus on the integration tests, but also how to do the end-to-end tests. I will admit that the approach I've taken is not completely in line with the Nest documentation. It would be how you do it in the testing frameworks independent of Nest, where you call them the endpoints, and you probably would, you know, want your own server, especially for the database layer, but also, you know, have the API endpoint somewhere else. Or you could do it, rather than doing it like with the actual real data layer, you could mock the data, but then you would have to set things up with this way. And if you're doing the end-to-end test and you got to do everything, it's going to be time consuming, and you got to really juggle up if that's going to be worth it. But at least you know how to go about solving that problem, and with this information. Once again, if you have done it in this particular case, and if some good Samaritan would want to do the end-to-end test in this way as a really good exercise, please just go ahead and post that to me, or send me a GitHub pull request or something like that, or just message me and link me your repo or something, particularly with all the guards and all the stuff set up. I'd be quite happy to take a look at that, maybe even make a video on it or something like that. But for now, that's all I really want to cover on testing with NestJS. We've done the unit test, integration test, and speculated the end-to-end test. I suppose in the next video I want to take a look on the front end on doing the same sort of thing in our Angular project, unit tests and all the other tests. And then finally, probably after that, I might have a look at doing some WebSocket stuff with chat. So yeah, thanks so much for watching this video. If you've liked it and it's been helpful, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you have any suggestions, please comment those in below the video, and I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.